Tonight's message is entitled Math, Logic, Music, and the Existence of God. As you may know about me, I was once an atheist, did not believe in God, did not believe in the Bible whatsoever. I was very much like someone that you probably have seen on television before in various capacities, a comedian named Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais, in an interview with Stephen Colbert on one of those late night shows, he had this to say about God's existence. Ricky Gervais, as you might know, is an atheist and a very vocal one. Here's what he said. This is atheism in a nutshell. You say there's a God. I say, can you prove that? You say, no. I say, I don't believe you then. So this is the argument that he is making here. He's basically saying that he doesn't have any proof that God exists, therefore he's just not going to believe it. And you can appreciate this line of reasoning that if you don't have proof of something, then why are you going to believe it? Common thing that's noted today, that's claimed today, is that Christians don't have any proof that God exists. But is that true? I would suggest to you, as a former atheist, it's not true at all. And in other videos I've talked about, in other presentations I've talked about some of the more common arguments of God's existence. But tonight I wanted to look for proof of God's existence from some pretty odd places. I want to look to math, logic, and music as evidences of God's existence. So tonight, what are we going to do? We're going to do just that. First, we'll talk about math and the existence of God. I'll try and show you how math demonstrates that God must exist. Then we'll go and we'll talk about logic and the existence of God. I'll explain to you what logic is, help you understand that. And then we want to look at music and the existence of God. And finally, we want to try and tie all these together with a common idea. There's a common element that these have in common that helps us even further understand that God must exist. So let's get started then with math and the existence of God. There's a key idea that's sort of overarching all of these concepts that we'll be talking tonight. And that key idea is that of abstracts. That each of these that we're going to talk about, music, math, logic, these are all abstract concepts. And an abstract, if you go to dictionary.com, an abstract is something that's apart from concrete realities, specific objects, or actual instances. And something that's abstract is immaterial. It's real, but you cannot touch it, you cannot see it, and you cannot measure it. That is what an abstract is. So when we talk about mathematics, it's abstract. We talk about logic, it's abstract. We talk about music, it's abstract. So that's a very key component of this whole presentation, this whole discussion of God's existence. And the reason that is important to point out is that in Ricky Gervais' worldview, for example, the atheist worldview, the way he views the world, what he thinks about the world, there is really no room for an abstract. There's no room for anything immaterial. Let me try and show you this. This is from space.com, and it's a discussion of the Big Bang. What happened, according to evolutionists, in the Big Bang. And what we want to see here is there is no room for abstracts in here. So space.com, go all the way back to the beginning, to the atheist worldview, and see what was there at the beginning, and then let's deduce a few things from it. Around 13.7 billion years ago, according to the evolutionist, everything we know of was an infinitesimally small singularity. In other words, all the matter in the universe was down to something so small you couldn't see it. A point of infinite denseness and infinite heat. Then explosive expansion began, ballooning our universe outwards faster than the speed of light. Now let's just pause here and let's notice some of the words that are being used. I've highlighted these in yellow. These words, denseness, heat, ballooning, faster, speed of light, these are not abstract. Everything that was existing at the Big Bang was a physical, material reality, something that could be seen, measured, or touched. All right? Not abstract. Let's go on. Space.com continues. When cosmic inflation came to a sudden and still mysterious end, there's a very key word. We could talk about that. We won't. Mysterious. I thought science dealt with hard, cold facts. Now we've got a mystery. Sounds like faith, doesn't it? Anyway, a flood of matter and radiation, known as reheating, began the process of populating our universe with the stuff we know today: particles, atoms, stars, and galaxies. So look at this. Again, we've got matter, radiation, stuff, particles, atoms, stars, and galaxies. There is nothing abstract in the beginning, according to the evolutionist worldview, according to evolution. And this view of things is called naturalism. Naturalism. And according to a Google search from Oxford Languages, naturalism is the belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes. You see, there is nothing but physical, concrete, measurable items in existence. There is nothing immaterial, nothing that you can't measure, see, or touch. So this is the key as we go through these three concepts here in a moment. The key is that in Ricky Gervais' worldview, in the atheist worldview, in the evolutionist worldview, there is no room for anything that is not physical and measurable. Remember, we go all the way back to the beginning according to them, and all there was matter and energy. Physical stuff. There was nothing abstract. Therefore, there should be no abstracts in the universe following that. How do we get abstracts, immaterial things, from material things? That's the problem. So if naturalism is true, there should be no abstracts. There should be nothing that's real that is not physical, measurable, concrete. You can see it, feel it, touch it, or in some way measure it with some kind of a device. So now let's look at the concept of math and the existence of God. Math and the existence of God. First of all, I want you to see that math hints at the infinite. When we look into mathematics, we see some things that sort of make us scratch our head and say, why is this here? Why is this way? For example, numbers can go on forever. We can count forever. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and go on, millions, billions, trillions, quadrillions, and so on. When I was in the 7th grade, we had to memorize those types of numbers all the way out to 10 or 12 places: billions, millions, trillions, quadrillions, and so on. I don't remember much of that anymore, but you can go on forever. Interesting, isn't it? You can go on forever. There's no stopping. Infinity, this concept here, you've seen this symbol. According to Britannica.com, infinity is the concept of something that is unlimited, endless, without bound. The common symbol for infinity, the little like 8 on its side, was invented by the English mathematician John Wallis in 1655. So infinity is built into numbers, and it hints at something, that there is some part of existence that goes on and on and on forever. And there's another one. We're going to talk about this one in a moment as well, but the measurement of pi, this Greek symbol here on the right. Pi is when you take a circle and you put a dot right in the middle. All right, the diameter is how you go all the way across the circle, but half of that diameter is called the radius. Well, what we figured out is if you take that radius and divide it into the total length of that circle, you get a number every single time. And that number is 3.14159,265, and so on. And what's interesting is that number never repeats and it never ends. So if you just take a circle and you take the radius and you divide it into that the circumference, you get a number that never ends. According to scientificamerican.com, with computational advances, thanks to computers, we now know more than the first 6 billion digits of pi. The first 6 billion. But we've gone 6 billion digits out past that decimal point, and we still have not found it repeating, and we have not found an end to it. Numbers hint at infinity. Math hints at infinity. So let's talk about God's existence. How can we deduce God's existence from mathematics? Here's the key. Mathematical formulas, which are abstracts, apply to physical objects. Mathematical formulas, they're abstract. You can't touch them. They're immaterial. You can't measure them in any way. they apply to things that are physical. So we have this connection between the physical and the abstract or immaterial. Let's look at a couple of examples. For example, pi applies to every circle. Every physical circle there is, whether it's in nature or if it's made by man. For example, I was just looking here on my desk, and I've got an iPhone. All right, and there's a circle. You probably can't see it, but there's a circle button on the bottom of that iPhone. Well, if you take the radius of that circle and you divide it into the total circumference, you're going to get 3.14 and so on. All right? Now over here, I've got a speaker. Let's see if I can get this without breaking my wires. We have a speaker. See that speaker? That speaker has a circle on it. Well, guess what? That speaker, just like the circle on this phone, will show the exact same number. If I take a bubble from a child's little toy where you dip the little round thing in the bubble water and you blow it, you get a bubble, you get a circle, very, very close to an absolute perfect circle. Guess what? Pi applies to that. So we've got this mathematical abstract idea, concept, but it applies to every single circle that exists ever, anywhere. Very interesting, isn't it? Also, the area of the circle. So if you take that circle and you say, how much is in there? How much space is in there? If I take pi, 3.14 and so on, and take the radius and square it and multiply those two together, I will get the area of every circle that ever exists anywhere in the world, physical, natural, or man-made. Every single time. Every single time. And then we have something called the Pythagorean theorem. And I used this when I was doing construction. And that is applies to right triangles. And basically what happens here, if you look at this graphic, there is a relationship between the A side of this triangle, see the right triangle, the 90 degrees in the bottom left between A and B, that's the right angle. If you take A and B, there's a relationship between the length of A, the length of B, and the length of C. So you can use this theorem to figure out if you've got a square in your corner, if you're building, say, a base for a deck. And I would use that. I would measure, and then I would measure C. I would get C right, and then I knew that when I had the C at the end of A and the end of B, that I would have a perfect right angle in that corner. Well, guess what? That theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, applies to every right triangle in existence. So if I were to take this right here, this is a little device we use. See if you can see this. I'll put it over so you can see it a little better. This is a little device that we plug into the computer so we can read little memory cards from cameras. Again, I'm not sure you can see that. Well, let's look at this little box. If I took this box and I cut it in half, down like this, and I wanted to know how far is it from that corner to that corner, all I would need to do is measure this side A, the bottom side B, and then put it into that formula. Every single square I could do divided into two right triangles or rectangles, and I could know what the measurements are. We've got an abstract concept, doesn't exist in any physical way, but it applies to every physical thing there is. That is very interesting, if you ask me. In the beginning, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, numbers are introduced. Ideas of mathematics are introduced by God. In Genesis 1, God identifies what we call ordinal numbers. Numbers defining order, first, second, third. Remember, he says on the first day, on the second day, on the third day. These are called ordinal numbers. And in doing so, God introduces natural numbers, 1, 2, 3. God also identifies pairs and sets. 2 animals, 2 humans, 6 days. But here's the thing to remember, and this is it. You might say, well, that's obvious. I mean, obviously he's just counting. But here's the thing you've got to remember. This is the very first activity in the whole of time. There has been no counting thus far. There are no people. There's no math that's been discovered by human beings. By the way, we discover math. We don't create it. None of that. God is creating the physical world, and then he is speaking these fundamental abstract concepts over that world right at the very beginning. So mathematics, these abstract concepts, were grouped together and tied to the physical world in Genesis 1 and 2. Creation.com had this to say about numbers in Genesis. A fundamental mathematical concept in Genesis 1 is the inclusion of entities in sets. 6 days of creative activity and 2 great lights. Talking about the sun and the moon. Sets are based on the abstract concept that assumes the existence of universals and not merely particulars. What this means, I put this in the quote here, it means that it assumes the abstract concept that we can classify things, that there aren't just individual things, a tree, a man, a rock, but there are classes of things. There are humans, there are trees, there are rocks. You see what I mean? Not just individuals, but groups and classes, by which each entity is viewed as independent from all others. The correspondence, and this is the point that I'm making here, the correspondence, that is the relationship between the abstract, immaterial idea, math concepts, such as ordinal counting and sets, and phenomenon in nature is difficult for naturalists to explain. What he's saying here is, how is it that in the Big Bang, if all there was matter and energy, physical things, how is it that we can have these abstract ideas that are just as real apply to that physical? Where did the abstract come from if everything was only physical in the beginning? If mathematics is purely an invention of human minds, then it is a challenge to explain the correspondence between a mathematical equation and what happens in the natural realm. You see, how do you explain that every circle, a pi applies to it? Every area of a circle is pi r squared. The length of the long side of a right triangle is always a squared plus b squared equals c squared. How do you explain that in the natural realm if everything is just physical? How do we explain abstract math concepts then? Mathematics is impressed upon creation because it is an outflow of the Creator's mind. You cannot separate the physical from the abstract because the immaterial abstract comes from the mind of the Creator who made the physical. They cannot be separated because God is overarching the creation. Math, therefore, is clear evidence of God's existence. Now let's move on and talk about logic. Logic and the existence of God. Again, repeating the idea that we're looking at abstract concepts like math and logic and seeing how a naturalist or an evolutionary or an atheistic worldview could explain those. Let's look at logic and the existence of God. What is logic? Let's look at a couple of different definitions. Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, who is a very brilliant creation scientist, he said this: logic is the science of the relations between propositions or claims. Logic can tell us what can be concluded from a given proposition. So we make certain claims or propositions, and then we can determine certain things from those propositions. I'm going to give you an example in a moment, so hang tight and don't get too discouraged with the detail here. Dr. Jason Lisle, another creation scientist, we actually hosted him in our home about 10 or 15 years ago when the kids were really little. I don't know if they remember him, but he came to see us. He actually came to the church that I pastor was the very first place he ever spoke. He says this: the laws of logic tell us what conclusions we may legitimately draw from any given premises or any given claims. In a sense, the laws of logic describe the correct chain of reasoning from premises to conclusion. So from other words, from making claims about truth and stating claims to drawing the right conclusion. There is a correct chain of reasoning. And this is sort of how he is defining it. Let me give you an example of a logical argument. Now, when we're talking about logical arguments, we're not talking about fighting. We're talking about making a case via propositions and conclusions to try and prove something or demonstrate some truth. Here's the premise, the first premise, or proposition or truth claim. The Bible says homosexuality is a sin. That's premise 1. Premise 2, the Bible is true. Therefore, the conclusion, or the third proposition or claim that come out of the first two, is it is true that homosexuality is a sin. This is a logical argument. If premise 1 is true, if premise 2 is true, then premise 3 must be true. That's the argument. You see how that works? Well, let's talk about why logic is important. First of all, let me hit the law of non-contradiction. We're going to tie this in here in just a moment. The law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction is a logical argument. It's a logical principle. And it says this: something cannot be true and not true at the same time and in the same situation. Let me give you an example. This is an example of a logical principle, logical truth. So this statement cannot be true. Wes is teaching this session. Wes Moore is sitting here teaching this session, and Wes Moore is not teaching this session. You see, those are contradictions. They both cannot be true. This is an example of how logic will help us. So let me use this now to tie into something very practical. Let's look at this. Let me walk through something that I am famous for. I've mentioned this before. I am famous for losing little stuff. Not really losing it forever, but just not paying attention to where it was. Famous for losing my keys. Keys, wallet, phone. Went for a bike ride today. Couldn't find the water bottle I had just filled up. Okay, little stuff like that. Let's say you've lost your keys. Let's look at how important logic is to actually finding your keys. All right, so I can't find my keys. I walk in, I can't find my keys. Someone says, look in the drawer. Look in that drawer. And I say, I checked that drawer. My keys are definitely not in that drawer. I open that drawer up. I look in there. It's empty. There is nothing in there. There's no way I can be wrong. There is literally no set of keys in that drawer. All right. So here's the law of non-contradiction, and here's how logic applies to real life, physical life. Your keys cannot be both not in that drawer and in that drawer at the same time. Do you see that? So once I go to that drawer and I say there is nothing in there, except one of my kids is goofing off with me and hides it in there after the fact, those keys will not be in that drawer. They have to be somewhere else. So if the law of non-contradiction was not true, I could never find my keys. You see that? Because I would go to that drawer and I would open it and I would see there's nothing in there. And I know because of the law of non-contradiction, even though I couldn't maybe say those words, I know that because they're not in there, they cannot be not in there and in there at the same time. So I move on and keep looking for my keys. And everywhere I go, I actually use the law of non-contradiction. I use logic and I check my pockets, not in there. So the law of non-contradiction says they're not in there. I go to my car, they're not in there. I go to the table under the vanity, not there. You see what I mean? The law of non-contradiction, logic helps me find my keys. So in a very real way, it applies to physical life. I found an article on UK essays entitled The Importance of Logic in Language. And I thought it was a good article to just identify how, even if we don't understand that we're using logic, how absolutely critical logic is to life. And they gave several examples of the importance of logic in everyday living. So let me walk you through this. Problem solving. Logic allows us to analyze concepts, arguments, and problems. So we have a problem at work, we have a problem at home. We're using reasoning to figure out how to solve the problem. What do we need to do to make this right? Without logic, we couldn't solve a problem. See, that's very important, isn't it? Communication. We use logic to present ideas in a way that's understandable. We think through, and teachers and preachers do this constantly, and it's really one of the hardest parts of teaching, is to figure out a way to organize material. So when I was working on this presentation, for example, I had to spend a lot of time putting this information in the right order, building upon one point of another and making sense of the material. And hopefully it will make sense to you. If it makes sense to you, it's because I am in my mind using logic to formulate it and arrange it in a way that makes sense. Okay? Otherwise you couldn't understand it. To persuade. To build and defend your own views. So to make an argument, to make a case for something. If you think you deserve a raise, what are you going to say? I come here on time, I work very hard, I accomplish this project under budget. You see, you're making a case, you're making a logical argument. Those are premises leading to a conclusion. Therefore, I deserve to get paid more. Without logic, you could never argue for a raise. And then finally, decision making. To learn, analyze, and make decisions. You couldn't make a decision in your family budget. You couldn't make a decision about where to go for dinner. You couldn't make a decision about anything if you didn't have logic and reasoning. So it really does apply. Logic was an abstract, but without logic, I can't physically find my keys. I can't solve my problems. I can't communicate well. I can't persuade. You see, this abstract has a lot to do with the success of human life. So we fundamentally need logic to live. You see that? If you take logic out, if you take that abstract out, life would just be nothing but chaos and confusion. Where did it come from if evolution is true? Where does this abstract come from if everything in the beginning was only physical and material? The source of logic is actually God, the Creator who is overarching the creation. Jason Lisle, we mentioned him a moment ago, the creation scientist. He wrote in an article called "Did God Create Logic?" He wrote this: "The laws of logic are a reflection of the way God thinks, and thus the way He expects us to think. The law of non-contradiction," and this is why I mentioned it and tied this quote in. See, I'm reasoning through. You see that? The law of non-contradiction is not simply one person's opinion of how we ought to think. It's just not my opinion or your opinion that we ought to use the law of non-contradiction. Rather, it stems from God's self-consistent nature. God cannot deny Himself, 2 Timothy 2:13. And all truth is in God. Therefore, truth will not contradict itself. Do you see that? So beyond this universe, behind it, the source of it, the thing that holds it up and keeps it in place, has a mind. And that mind is impressed upon the very nature of the reality that exists in that created world. And because that being is true, that being is consistent, and that being never changes, then there cannot be contradictions in the world. He goes on, laws of logic cannot exist in a materialistic, atheistic universe. Now, materialism just means a physical world, physical only. Because laws of logic are not material, they're not physical. The laws of logic are a universal standard for reasoning. Every person in the world who thinks through things properly is going to use reasoning. It doesn't matter what age they are, what culture they're from, what language they speak. It doesn't matter if they were Greeks in the Roman Empire or Chinese today or Americans 100 years ago. It universally applies, this way of reasoning. But how can an atheist have a universal standard for anything? Atheists do believe in laws of logic, but they cannot justify the existence of universal, abstract, unchanging laws within their worldview. Do you see? If we start off and everything is physical, then there can be no abstracts. But we see that there's a very real abstract called reasoning and logic. How do we explain that? Well, the atheist has a very difficult time explaining that. But the Christian, the Bible-believing Christian, does not. The Christian believes in universal, immaterial, unchanging entities because God is Himself omnipresent, meaning He's everywhere, immaterial, you can't touch, feel, or measure Him with a physical device, and unchanging. Moreover, God has thoughts, and these thoughts are reflected in the way He upholds the universe. That is why we have the abstract of logic that universally applies, because it comes from the mind of the Creator and it applies to His creation, because He is in and through and sustaining that entire creation. Logic is proof of God's existence. Now let's talk about music. Music. Who loves music? I absolutely love music. And I may have mentioned this before, but I listen to music all the time. I always have music on. And the kids are making fun of me because I have so many different types of music that I like. From 80s rock to, classical music, piano solos, country, Jackson Brown from the 70s. I mean, I have all kinds of music that I like. How does music, this abstract concept of music, show us that God exists? Let's look at that. First of all, what is music? You ever thought of what music is? Let's look at a definition. Music is a vocal or instrumental sound, or both, in other words, singing and instruments, combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion. Now, it's very important to note that music is not simply sound. The sound waves that are produced through music are physical and you can measure them. But that does not constitute the music. What constitutes the music, easy for me to say, is that it is a particular arrangement of those sounds. I could beat on a set of drums all day long with no arrangement, and you would not call that music. Music is the arrangement of sounds in order to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion. Therefore, an arrangement is an abstract concept. It's not something you can touch. It's not something you can measure. It is immaterial. An arrangement, if you look that up, is when you put things in a neat, attractive, or required order. Order is key here. This is an abstract. So music, the formulation of the music, the backdrop of this image here is the actual symbols of the music written on a sheet where you're writing out the arrangement. That is the music. The sounds are simply what flow out of that arrangement. Okay? So we need to understand music well before we can see how it applies. So that musical abstract, how do we know that that is real? Well, let's look at the power of music and the reality of music by what music does for the human being. And these are as real as any physical object you could find. Real as that phone I showed you earlier. This power and this reality. And that's why we love music so much. Let's show you. First of all, music does move the emotions, doesn't it? Have you ever been... I have... my absolute favorite music is piano solos. And I found a guy named Silvard, S-I-L-V-A-R-D. Just listening to Pandora, I found a guy named Silvard. I don't know his first name. I take it that's his last name. But he has an album. I can't remember the name of it. But what I was able to do is go to Amazon and find him and find that album. And I downloaded 4 or 5 songs from it. And what I like to do is I like to listen to his music before I go to bed. And I'm telling you, for me, it's just me. You could be totally different. When I listen to that music from him, that album, those piano solos, no words, I get so close to God, I can hardly stand it. I almost want to jump up and down and scream because I feel Him come so near, because I am so in awe of how He could make a creature that could write such beauty. He could make a creature who could arrange such beautiful things, such powerful sounds, and then He gives me the ears that I can hear it. He gives me a mind that I can understand it, and I am just in awe of God as I lay there and I just adore Him for His magic and His majesty in music. It moves me. Does music move you? It probably does. That's real, isn't it? It might not be material, but that is real. How about this? It calms the spirit. Do you have different times that you like different types of music? I've learned, because I think I've told you this, but I deal with a lot of depression. I've had a lot of depression in my life. And one of the coping mechanisms I've found for music for depression is when I am in a down mood, there's certain kinds of music that I can't listen to because it'll draw me down. But there are other types of music that I listen to that pulls me up. Music calms the spirit. It engages the spirit. It helps. It's affects our mental state, our state of mind, our point of view, doesn't it? That's real. Might not be material, but that is absolutely real. And then it provides therapy for disease. I was having lunch with a customer a couple of years ago, and he was telling me about his daughter. And his daughter was a music therapist. And her job was to go around and use music to, sorry, my phone just beeped. Her job was to go around and use music as a form of therapy on Alzheimer's patients. And I was so fascinated with this, and I did some research on it, and I found something on it. According to SeriousScience.org, well, I think I've got the wrong reference here, so forgive me for that. I think this was for a previous reference. I forgot to copy it correctly. But here's what I found. One source said this: music offers a host of benefits for Alzheimer's patients. Studies show music therapy improves a patient's focus, improves their ability to communicate, and may lower the dependence on drugs. Now that is an abstract concept, music, an abstract reality affecting the physical life of a human being. The source went on to say, researchers believe music stimulates many parts of the brain. So we have an abstract, immaterial thing that's stimulating the physical brain, such as those areas affecting language, mood, and movement, along with the senses of hearing, sight, sound, and touch. Research at the University of California at Davis pinpointed an area of the brain which stores memories by linking them to familiar songs and the emotions associated with those memories. So music, while abstract, is very, very real and has a very real impact on physical human beings. So how do we explain the effect upon the human body and mind of the abstract reality of music? We have the same argument here. We're using logic all the way through this. The same argument. It's because God, the Creator, who overarches and infuses all of creation, has given it to us. God loves music. God created music. In Job 38:7, God is talking about the creation. It's actually God speaking here. He's talking about the creation. When He was creating in that week, when we just talked about Genesis 1 with the math, first day, second day, third day, He's saying that the morning stars, or the angels, sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. He's saying that the angels were singing in the background while He was creating. God loves music. God created music. That's why we have music. All the way to the end of time, Revelation 14. John is taken up into heaven. What does he see? And I heard a voice from heaven. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. So in heaven there are creatures playing musical instruments. They sang, there's music, as it were a new song before the throne, before the four living creatures and the elders. So here we got the creation, singing and sound. We got at the end in heaven, we've got God being praised and rejoicing in the music that He created, these instruments. In Genesis 4, the great-great-grandson of Cain, notice what it says about him. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and the flute. So from very early on in human history, human beings were making instruments. Why? Why? Because God is the source of music. God has given us this abstract. It comes out of His mind, something that He loves. Robert Doolin on creation.com, he said this: music provides joy because music has been provided by God. The theory of evolution can never postulate even a faintly satisfactory explanation for the origin of music or why it affects us. When we realize that God wants us to worship Him through music, we see God as the master musician, the conductor of all life. Music, the abstract concept of music, is proof or evidence of the existence of a Creator. Now let's tie all of this together. How is it that the abstract concepts of mathematics, logic, and music come all together? Very briefly. Let's look at this. What ties the abstract concepts of math, logic, and music together? Think about it. What is it that is recognizing math, logic, and music? What is doing that? The human mind. It is the human mind alone in the entire universe that recognizes and uses and benefits from mathematics, logic, and music. No animals do, no physical objects do, no sun, no stars, no moon. The only place that these abstracts are recognized and valued and used is in our mind. How do we explain that? Why can the human mind alone conceptualize these things? And here is why. Because the human mind alone has been made in the image of God. God has shared with us these aspects of His immaterial self in our minds. Therefore, we can recognize the abstract in the creation, and only we can, because only we have been given that image. God shares His mind. Genesis 1:26, the creation week now, the very last day of creation week, day 6 of creating. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. You have the evidence of God inside you, your mind. Now let's circle back to Ricky Gervais, and let's see how this applies to what he said. Here is the very ironic thing about this. And this is beautiful and this is powerful. Look at this. The fact that Ricky Gervais can count, that he can argue against God's existence, and enjoy music proves God is real. So, what does that mean? Ironically, the atheist himself is evidence of what he does not believe. How about that? That'll make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. The fact that this man exists, he has a mind, and he does the things he does, prove that what he's saying is simply not true. Ricky Gervais is evidence that God exists.